All right, so lab number 9 and lab number 10 are focused in on primate classification. Lab number 9 is actually really short. Lab number 9 is just kind of introducing you to the idea of what classification entails and how scientists are going to classify living organisms. And then lab number 10 is a bit longer because it's going to focus in on specifically primate classification. All right, so let's talk about first how we identify or how we distinguish a primate from other mammals. So we of course have some things in common with other mammals. We have fur, we're able to maintain a constant body temperature. We call that homeothermic. We have mammary glands and we give birth to live young. So these are the features that we have in common with the other mammals. So primates as an order emerged approximately 65 million years ago. And these are the characteristics that are unique to primates. So if the question is asking you to identify features that are unique to primates, these are the features that you would want to use. So primates have opposable thumbs. So that means thumbs that have grasping abilities. So that's advantageous for arboreal adaptations. So adaptations related to living in the trees. And then much later, once we get to humans and our ancestors, that will be beneficial for the use and production of stone tool technology. We have protection of the orbits of the eyes. Most primates, the vast majority of us, have what we call full post-orbital closure. The only exception is the lower order Strepsirrhines, also called prosimians. The prosimians only have a post-orbital bar. They don't have full closure. So I'll show you what that looks like here in a few slides. But just so you know now, the vast majority of all primates have full post-orbital closure. So that just means that there's bony material protecting their eye sockets, their orbits. In general, primates are going to have a larger brain size in comparison to body size. So we call that increased encephalization. So in comparison with the other mammals, the brain size of a primate is larger in comparison to the overall body size. So that'll be related to intelligence, offspring being very dependent upon their parents for survival. And of course, once we get into humans, we're going to see an expansion of cranial capacity well beyond what you would expect for a mammal of our size. The vast majority of primates will have nails instead of claws on all digits, on all fingertips and toe tips. Again, the only exception will be some of the lower order Strepsirrhines or prosimians. They have a combination of nails and claws. But the vast majority, all the higher order primates have nails on all digits, and we also have tactile pads on the tips of all of our fingertips and toe tips. Primates have forward-facing orbits, also called forward-facing eyes. So that just means that our eyes are rotated to be in the front of our face, which enhances our depth perception. Most primates also have color vision. So those are adaptations related to living in the trees. Obviously, if you're leaping from branch to branch, it is extremely advantageous for you to have high quality depth perception and stereoscopic vision. So you know exactly where that next branch is to reach onto. And primates in general are going to only have one offspring per season. And most primates don't have offspring every season. They will have 2 to 3 years in between each birth. And one of the reasons for that is our offspring are born very dependent upon us for survival. We have very high levels of parental investment, meaning that we're investing a great deal in a few offspring rather than having dozens of offspring over our reproductive years. So we tend to have one live birth every couple seasons, and we invest a great deal in very dependent offspring. All right, so primates can be terrestrial or arboreal, and most of them are actually a combination of both of those. So that term terrestrial means mainly ground dwelling. So if we say that a primate is predominantly terrestrial, we mean that that primate spends the vast majority of his or her time on the ground. And if we say that a primate is predominantly arboreal, it's the opposite. It means that that primate spends most of his or her time active in the trees. So some primates are nocturnal and some are diurnal. The vast majority of primates are diurnal. Diurnal means active during the day. Nocturnal means predominantly active at night. So the primates that are nocturnal include some of the lower order prosimians, also called Strepsirrhines, and some of the, there's a few New World monkeys that are active during the nighttime. Primates have generalized dentition with a variety of food. So like I always tell you guys, in the game of evolution, diversity wins. So this is believed to be one of the reasons why primates are so adaptable and are so successful. They have a wide variety of foods they can eat. They may specialize in certain food types. For example, some primates specialize in eating mainly foliage or vegetation. Some will specialize in eating mainly fruits. Some will specialize in eating mainly insects. And some are going to eat a combination of all of those things: plants, fruits, insects, and even some amount of meat. But in general, all primates have what we call dietary plasticity or dietary flexibility. So if all of a sudden one plant source or one fruit source is no longer available or not available during a certain season, that primate group can easily just switch to another food source during that time. So again, that makes them more adaptable. Primates have color vision and enhanced depth perception, which is part of their adaptation to living in the trees, as well as, of course, dietary plasticity. If you can view the different colorations that are present in various plants and fruits, you may be able to identify which ones might be dangerous or poisonous, and then which ones are safe for eating. And in general, out of all the senses, primates are going to focus in on touch and sight over smell and hearing. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't also rely on smell and hearing. They just, if we were to put all the senses and rank them, primates rely the most on touch and sight. So again, that's related to their arboreal adaptations, dietary plasticity, and of course, much later on, our ability to use and produce stone tool technologies. Obviously, a sense of touch and those tactile pads on our digits are going to be important for that ability. All right, so a little bit of a review. When we're talking about classification, it's going to use terminology such as primitive features and derived features. So easy way to think about it: primitive means old or original, and then derived features are the newer features in evolutionary terms. So primitive features are those that encompass the entire order of primates that our original ancestors would have had. So the primitive features are going to be present in mainly the prosimians and the strepsirrhines. Whereas the derived features, those are the features that have evolved more recently in evolutionary past. So derived features are generally just going to encompass just a specific grouping, just the platyrrhines, or just the catarrhines, or just the hominoids, for example. So we'll talk about those derived features in more detail in the upcoming slides. So some examples: mammals may have thumbs, but only primates have opposable thumbs. So thumbs in general would be a primitive trait, but the derived trait would be the opposable thumbs. So these help put primates into different taxonomic categories. All right, so underneath the order primate, so we're going to have two main subdivisions, two main suborders. So the strepsirrhines and the Haplerines are the kind of new age or newer way of classifying. But just so it doesn't confuse you guys, you may see it referred to as prosimians and anthropoids. And I'll tell you why. They do actually have a good reason why they changed the classification here. So the strepsirrhines, also called the prosimians, are the most primitive or ancestral of the primate order. So these are the features that will help you identify them. So this will be very important for lab number 10. So the strepsirrhines are the only primates that have only a post-orbital bar. They do not have full closure. And I'm sorry, I wish I had a lemur skull to show you guys. But just so you know, if there was no closure, there would be an opening here. So this part of the eye here, that's the post-orbital bar. And then what you're seeing here inside the orbit, so we have full post-orbital closure. So that means we have bony material that is completely protecting our orbits. But if you were looking at a prosimian, a strepsirrhine, you would see an opening here. Okay, I have a picture for you here in a moment. So also the prosimians, the strepsirrhines, are going to have a grooming claw and a tooth comb. So the tooth comb is the lower incisors jutting straight forward. So that's a grooming feature that's present only in the strepsirrhines. And some of the strepsirrhines have a rhinarium, which is a wet nose. So that's related to their primitive retention of the ability to smell. So that's kind of a unique thing about the strepsirrhines. They're the only primates that have retained that primitive reliance upon smell. So if you see a rhinarium, if you see a wet nose, and you've already determined it's a primate, then you know it must be a lower order strepsirrhine. Some are nocturnal, but not all of them. Some lemurs are nocturnal. Some of the lorises are nocturnal. and some of the galagos are nocturnal. So some examples of primate species that fit under Strepsirrhines: all of the lemurs, which are found exclusively in Madagascar, lorises that are found in Southeast Asia, galagos, or also called bush babies, those are found in Central Africa, and the aye-ayes, that's a type of lemur that are found in Madagascar. The aye-ayes are nocturnal. All right, so then the higher order, so you might also see them called lower order. Lower order are Strepsirrhines, higher order are Haplerines. So the Haplerines are going to have more of those derived features. So remember, derived just means they have evolved more recently in our past. So they do in fact have full post-orbital closure. So that just means there's full closure, full protection around the orbits. So if you turned it this way, you wouldn't be able to see any sort of opening. So basically all of the platyrrhines, all the catarrhines, apes, humans, old world monkeys, new world monkeys, they all have full post-orbital closure. They all have nails instead of claws on all of their digits. And because they have a reliance on vision and touch, they have lost that moist rhinarium. They all have a dry nose and a fused mandible. They are all diurnal, meaning that they're active predominantly during the day. So this will include both New World and Old World monkeys. I'll tell you how to distinguish New World from Old World here in a second. Apes, and of course, humans. Okay, so your two main suborders, if you're envisioning a primate classification chart, your two divisions that go right under primate are going to be the Strepsirrhines, the lower orders, and then the Haplerines, the higher orders. You guys have questions so far? You guys are good? Okay. All right, so here's just some pictures of Strepsirrhines. So this is a loris here. Lorises are found in Southeast Asia. This is a ring-tailed lemur. Lemurs are found exclusively in Madagascar. And this is an example of a galago or a bush baby that you would find in Central Africa. All right, so some pictures of what I mean by post-orbital closure. So if you're attempting to determine, okay, first of all, let's determine if we're even looking at a primate. So you can see here this raccoon skull. You can see there's an opening here into the orbits, and there's not even a bar right there. So if there's an opening and there's no bar, then you know that you're not looking at a primate. And then we have our lower order Strepsirrhine here. This is a lemur skull. So you see that there is an opening. However, you do have this bar here, this bar of bone. So this bar of bone is called the post-orbital bar. And then anything that's higher order, so if it's New World monkey, Old World monkey, ape, or human, anything that's Haplerine will not only have a post-orbital bar, but also has full closure of the orbits. Okay, so the vast majority of primates that you're going to see are going to have this full closure. The only exception will be those lower order primates, such as a lemur, lower order Strepsirrhines. Okay, you also can kind of look at the placement or the orientation of the orbits. So you can see that this lemur has a slight lateral. So remember that term lateral, those anatomical terms are going to come back to you over the next few chapters. So lateral facing just means directed towards the side. So you see with the raccoon, the orbits are completely on the side of the face. With the lemur, it's definitely rotated a little bit more towards the front, but there's a slight lateral orientation. And then in comparison, once you get to the gibbon, a higher order primate, the orbits have an anterior or forward orientation. So again, that's related to their enhanced ability for depth perception, which is an adaptation to living in the trees. All right, so these are the kind of the oddballs out, and this is why they had to completely change the taxonomic name of the primate order. So like I mentioned earlier, the original groups were prosimians for lower orders and then anthropoids for higher orders. So the reason for that is these tough guys to classify known as the tarsiers. So originally the tarsiers looked very primitive, and they also had features such as an unfused mandible. There wasn't full closure around the orbits. So originally the tarsiers were placed underneath the prosimians, the lower orders. So now that we have more advanced technology, they were able to do DNA analysis and show that the tarsiers are actually closer to the higher order primates. So that's when primatologists decided to rename the categories Strepsirrhines and Haplerines. So we now know that the tarsiers are actually, at least genetically speaking, they have more in common with the Haplerines. All right, so some features of the tarsiers. So definitely when you look at this picture of the tarsier, obviously a very small primate, the orbits are very, very large. So that's a good thing to note as well. One of your lab activities is asking you to determine between nocturnal and diurnal primates. So just like an owl has really large orbits, really large eyes, and can rotate his or her head almost 360 degrees, a tarsier can do the same. A tarsier is predominantly nocturnal, so that means that their orbits are very large, allowing for enhanced vision at night. And they can also rotate their neck about 360 degrees. So the tarsiers, where they got their name, they have very large, very long tarsal bones. So thinking back to chapter 6, we know that tarsals are ankle bones. So they essentially have extremely long tarsal bones that allow them to kind of springboard off of branches. So they do a type of locomotion called vertical clinging and leaping. So they're going to springboard off a branch and then leap out and grab onto another branch. So we're going to talk more about locomotion actually in chapter 12, but just for now, know that tarsiers are vertical clingers and leapers. So they have a mixture of traits. They have a mix of grooming claw and nails. They have eye protection that is somewhere in between a post-orbital bar and full closure. They do not have a dental comb, and they have extremely large eyes that are adapted for nocturnal lifestyles. So those are kind of the oddballs out. So the tarsiers actually are the ones that require them to completely rethink the taxonomic scheme of primates. All right, so now we're looking underneath just the Haplerane. So for a moment, forget about the Strepsirrhines and forget about the tarsiers. Let's focus in just on the Haplerines. So if you're envisioning a primate chart underneath underneath the suborder Haplerine, there's going to be the infraorder Platyrrhines and Catarrhines. So the Platyrrhines are more commonly known as the New World monkeys because they are found in the New World. There are no primates found naturally in North America, except humans, of course. But the New World is essentially the Americas, North America and South America. So we do find primates naturally in both Central and South America. So that's why we call them New World monkeys, because they're located in the New World. So some of the anatomical features, so those derived features that will help you identify a platyrrhine, are nostrils that are going to point off to the side, or again, you might see them called lateral facing nostrils. Remember that term lateral means off to the side. Their dental formula. So remember when we're doing dental formula, we're taking the jaw, the mandible, dividing it in half, and we're starting at the front of the mouth. So we start by counting the incisors. So for example, in a human, there's 2 incisors, 1 canine, and then in a human, there's only 2 premolars and then 3 molars. But if it's a New World monkey, if it's a platyrrhine, then they have an extra premolar. So their dental formula, if you count each quadrant, would be 2 incisors, 1 canine, 3 premolars, and 3 molars. Some will have what we call a prehensile tail. So that term prehensile simply means that there are grasping abilities. So as you notice here, this platyrrhine is actually hanging from a tree branch using his tail, which is allowing him to drink from a stream. It also would help him in more effective locomotion through the trees. So the platyrrhines are, because of this adaptation, the platyrrhines are predominantly arboreal. So that doesn't mean that they don't occasionally come down to the ground. Of course they do. It just means that the platyrrhines are going to spend the vast majority of their time locomoting in the trees. So that term locomote simply means how do they move? How do they get from point A to point B? So some examples of primates that we consider platyrrhines, that we classify as platyrrhines: capuchin monkeys, howler monkeys, spider monkeys, tamarins, and marmosets. So here's some pictures here. So this one here, this is a tamarin. So tamarins, they're one of the only primates that are going to have that. It's more common for them to have a dual birth, to have 2 infants at each birth. Tamarins oftentimes have twins. These are howler monkeys here. Howler monkeys are really famous for their howling, as you might imagine. They have really loud vocalizations that help them negotiate their territory over large landscapes. And this monkey here might look familiar to many of you. They often use capuchin monkeys in various TV shows. I believe it was the capuchin monkey that was in Friends. Also, there was a capuchin monkey in the Hangover movies, I believe. But again, when you're thinking about using primates in entertainment, at least I like to always be very careful that they're treating the primates properly. because primates are very intelligent animals, and it's very important to make sure that if they're being used in entertainment, that they're being treated properly. But these are all primates that are examples of New World monkeys. So we've got the tamarins here, we've got the howler monkeys, and we've got the capuchin monkey here. All right, so you guys have questions about platyrrhines, about New World monkeys? You guys are good on the New Worlds? Okay, so now envision your chart again. So we had at the very top, we have order primates, 2 divisions that go underneath primates. Over here, we've got the strepsirrhines, the lower orders. And then over here, we've got the Haplerines. So our first division that went underneath Haplerine was our platyrrhines, our New World monkeys that we just talked about. And now we're going to look at the other infraorder, which is called the catarrhines. So the catarrhines are going to include the Old World monkeys, apes, and humans. So those derived features that are going to help you identify a catarrhine would be nostrils that face either forward or downward. Their dental formula is going to be the same as ours. So we share a dental formula with all the Old World monkeys, the apes, and all of our ancestors, all of our hominin ancestors. So our dental formula is 2 incisors in each quadrant, 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. The Old World monkeys are going to have, not all of them have a tail, but a lot of them have a tail, but it is not prehensile. So that tail is just kind of useless, essentially. That tail is just hanging out there. It has no grasping abilities. And then if it's an ape or a human, we have a complete lack of a tail. We have the remnants of a tail. We still have the coccyx at the very bottom of our sacrum, but we don't have a full tail. So the Old World monkeys are generally a combination of terrestrial and arboreal. However, the Old World monkeys tend to be predominantly terrestrial, just meaning that they spend most of their time on the ground. So this infraorder, the catarrhines, can be further divided into 2 superfamilies, the Cercopithecoids and the Hominoids. So again, envisioning your chart at the very top, you have the order primates. 2 divisions below, you have the lower order strepsirrhines over here. You have the higher order Haplerines over here. And then underneath Haplerine, 2 divisions, 2 infraorders. You've got the platyrrhines and New World monkeys over here. And then you've got the catarrhines, the Old World monkeys, apes, and humans over here. And then we have 2 more divisions under catarrhines. Under catarrhines, we've got the Cercopithecoids, which includes just the Old World monkeys. And then over here, we're going to have the hominoids, which is going to include the apes and us. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about the Cercopithecoids. So the Cercopithecoids are going to include just the monkeys of the Old World. So if the New World is the Americas, the Old World is Africa and Asia. So not including zoos, of course, we're going to find the Cercopithecoids in Africa and Asia. So some of the derived features that will help you identify the Cercopithecoids is going to be a specific molar type. We're going to call their molars bilophodont. So bi means 2, and then dont means teeth. So when you're looking at their molar cuffs, and I have a picture here for you in a moment, but it's going to look very symmetrical, and there's going to be 4 distinctive molar cuffs. So they have a regular tail, not a prehensile one. So you notice here in the olive baboon, there is a tail, but it is not prehensile, meaning it does not have grasping abilities. Same thing in these black and white colobus monkeys over here. They have a tail, but it is not prehensile. The Cercopithecoids tend to be smaller than the hominoids, smaller than apes and humans. Some have something called Ischial Colossity or Ischial Calicytes. So if you remember back to when we were learning about the pelvis, so the pelvis, each innominate bone or os coxae has the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So the ischium is where we get this name from here. The Ischial Calicytes are an adaptation for long-term sitting in very hot terrestrial environments. So when you think about sitting down in a chair, the part of our pelvis that we're sitting on is the ischium. So remember, ischium sounds kind of like tushy. So same thing for these Old World monkeys. When they're sitting down, what they're actually sitting on is the ischium of their pelvis. So Ischial Calicytes or Ischial Callosity is essentially a fancy way of saying butt calluses. So when you're at the zoo, next time notice this. When you're looking at the baboons or other Old World monkeys, a lot of them have these really tough sitting pads on the rear. So that's an adaptation for sitting in very hot, humid terrestrial environments. Some of the Cercopithecoids will have cheek pouches for storing food. Like this proboscis monkey here, the proboscis monkey is predominantly vegetarian. So they actually store some of their vegetation here in their cheek pouches. They also have a chambered stomach, kind of like other herbivores do. That's somewhat unique. Most primates are not strictly herbivorous, except for the proboscis monkey, and actually gorillas are as well. So some examples of monkeys that fit underneath Old World, underneath Cercopithecoids, are all of the baboons. So there's many species of baboons. There's olive baboons, Hamadryas baboons, gelada baboons, mandrills, colobus monkeys, and langurs fit underneath the Old World monkeys. All right, you guys have questions about Old World monkeys before I move on to hominoids? You guys are good? Okay. All right, so thinking of our primate chart again, so at the very top, envision order primate. So your two divisions, your lower orders are called the Strepsirrhines over here. Your higher orders are called the Haplerines. So those are your two suborders. And then now underneath the Haplerines, we have two infraorders. We have the Platyrrhines, the New World monkeys, and then we have the Catarrhines, which include Old World monkeys, apes, and humans. And then underneath the Catarrhines, we have two more distinctions. We have superfamily Cercopithecoids, the Old World monkeys, and then we have superfamily Hominoidea, which is apes and humans. So apes and humans are the Old World, meaning Africa and Asia. In comparison to the other primates, they're going to have the largest relative brain size in comparison to body size, especially apes and humans. Their body size tends to be larger if you're comparing them to the other primates. They have a molar pattern that's called Y5. So because both the Cercopithecoids and Hominoidea both have a 2-1-2-3 dental formula, the easiest way to distinguish them from one another is to look at their molar pattern. And I'll show you a picture here in a moment. But remembering that the Cercopithecoids have that bilophodont molar pattern, and then the apes and humans will have this Y5 molar pattern. Another way to distinguish a hominoid away from the Old World monkeys is that they have no tail. So they have no tail. Of course, they still have the coccyx. They have the remnants of a tail, but they do not have an actual tail. So the apes themselves are divided into what we call the lesser apes and the greater apes. So just like you might expect, the lesser apes are smaller in body size and the great apes are larger. So lesser apes only include two species, the gibbons and the siamangs that you find in Asia, in Indonesia more specifically. Gibbons and siamangs are unique in the sense that they are very skilled brachiators. So brachiation is a form of locomotion. Remember, locomotion just means movement. So they're going to have really long arms that are going to allow them to swing from branch to branch. So we're going to learn more about locomotion in chapter 12. Another thing that's unique about the gibbons and siamangs, they're the only primates, other than some humans, of course, that practice monogamy as their predominant mating strategy. Most primates practice various forms of polygamy and polyandry, but gibbons and siamangs are the only species other than humans that will practice monogamy. But even with that, they practice what we call serial monogamy, which doesn't mean that they're necessarily with the same mate their entire lifespan. It means that they're with a series of different monogamous mates. So even with the gibbons and siamangs, it's not necessarily lifelong monogamy. And then the great apes, so the four big ones, the four big great apes, the orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos. And depending on who you're talking to, a lot of primatologists actually consider humans a fifth great ape. And then some primatologists give them a separate classification. I'll let you guys make up your mind on that. All right, so here's that picture I was telling you guys to distinguish the Old World monkeys from the apes, distinguishing Cercopithecoids from hominoids. The easiest way to do that, since obviously they have the same dental formula, easiest way to do that is to look at their Molar Cuffs pattern. So the bilophodont, what you would see in a Cercopithecoid, at least when I'm looking at it, to me, they look very symmetrical. It almost looks like you can divide those molars in half. And they have four kind of mountaintops, four cusps, but to me, they look very symmetrical. When you're looking at the molars, you can really see how they're divided in half. And then the Y5 molars, they're called Y5 because you can quite literally draw a Y in the valley of those cusps. So bilophodont, the very symmetrical molars, you're going to find those exclusively in the Cercopithecoids, the Old World monkeys. And then the Y5 molars, you're going to find those exclusively in the hominoids. So the lesser apes, the greater apes, and of course humans. All right, some other important features. So this term prognathism. So prognathism, in order to view prognathism, you want to look at a skull from the lateral view. So remember, a lateral view is a view from the side. So prognathic, let me show you an example of a skull that would be prognathic. So this is an Australopithecine here, since I don't have any primate skulls, but you can see that there is prognathism. So when you're looking at the lateral view, the mid face and the jaw are going to jut forward. So this is a very prognathic face. So it's when the teeth and jaws stick out further than the nose. If the nose sticks out further, then you would consider that more of a snout. So the other feature, I like to call this feature the bony mohawk. I like to give nicknames to features to make it easier to remember. But the sagittal crest is essentially the ridge of bone that goes down the sagittal suture. So again, remembering back to chapter 6, when we learned about the various bones that are in our skull and our cranium and the sutures that separate them, we have the two parietal bones that are separated by the sagittal suture that runs down the middle. So essentially the sagittal crest, that's that ridge or crest of bone that runs down the sagittal suture. So essentially the function for this is the attachment of jaw muscles. So I think I mentioned earlier, gorillas are one of the only primate species that are predominantly vegetarian. But gorillas are also very large animals. Male gorillas are around 400 pounds on average, and female gorillas are around 200 pounds on average. So you can imagine if they're only eating vegetation, and they also have very high caloric demands to support this very large body size, they're going to need to eat a lot of that vegetation in order to make that possible. So gorillas have jaw muscles that begin all the way down here at the ramus. Didn't mean to skip that yet. They start all the way down here at the ramus. Remember, that's part of the mandible here. And the jaw muscles tuck underneath the zygomatic bones, the cheekbones, and they actually attach all the way up here at the sagittal crest. Okay. So when you see this, this means that that animal eats a relatively poor quality diet and spends a lot of time chewing. Also, if you think about chewing a raw salad, raw vegetables, think about chewing lettuce, spinach, carrots, cucumbers, you guys get the point. But chewing raw vegetation actually does take quite a bit of jaw force, quite a bit of chewing force in comparison to, let's say, carbohydrates or even raw meat. So it does actually take quite a bit of chewing force to break up the cellulose in raw vegetation. So if you see a sagittal crest, it tells you that that animal likely eats a diet that requires a lot of chewing, a lot of jaw force. The sagittal crest feature is also going to be a sexually dimorphic feature that we're going to see in the gorillas. The male gorilla has a very prominent, very pronounced sagittal crest, and the females have either a non-existent or a very slight sagittal crest. All right, so still within the hominoids, let's talk about the lesser apes. So the gibbons and the siamangs, you find them in Asia. More specifically, you find them in Indonesia. Like I mentioned earlier, they are the only primate species other than humans that practice monogamy as their predominant reproductive strategy. But again, that's serial monogamy, not necessarily lifelong monogamy. They have adaptations that allow for brachiation. So brachiation is a form of locomotion that we're going to learn more about in chapter 12. But just for now, know that this locomotion pattern requires that they have extremely long arms and very powerful pectoral girdle. So remember that pectoral girdle, that's where the scapula articulates with the humerus and the clavicle. So they need really powerful shoulder muscles, and they need long arms to allow them to essentially locomote using predominantly their arms. They're hanging from branches and actually moving and locomoting through the branches using just their arms. And they also, similar to the Howler monkeys, they have very distinctive vocalizations that allow them to negotiate dominance and allow them to negotiate territory over very long distances. All right, so let's talk about just the great apes. Do you guys have questions so far before I talk about the great apes? You guys are good? Okay. All right, so the great apes include orangutans, gorillas, humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos. So orangutans are found exclusively in Borneo and Sumatra. They have a red-orange coloration. They are the only primate species that tends to live in solitary groups. As we're going to learn in the primate behavior section, a defining feature of primates is that we are social. So most primates live in troops of anywhere from 10 to hundreds of primates, but they live with multiple males, multiple females. and they tend to practice diverse mating strategies. But one of the reasons that orangutans unfortunately are so critically endangered is because of the way that they live in solitary groupings and their reproduction. So essentially the male is going to mate with all of the females that are in his territory. However, because of habitat destruction, because of the palm oil trade and deforestation going on in both Borneo and Sumatra, a lot of their habitat is being destroyed essentially. So those males are being separated from the females that they need to mate with. And oftentimes they don't have a safe way to then find that mate, because if they're trying to travel through a territory that's not protected by forests, they are more likely to be poached. So unfortunately, their residence patterns and their reproductive strategies are one of the reasons why they're so endangered. This term sexual dimorphism, we've talked about this a little bit already, but just to review, sexual dimorphism is just talking about differences in overall body size between males and females of the same species. So primate species that have high levels of sexual dimorphism are also going to tend to have high levels of competition, both for access to resources and also access to mates. So orangutans and gorillas, if we're looking at all the apes, orangutans and gorillas have the highest level of sexual dimorphism. So with both orangutans and gorillas, the males are generally at least double the size of females. So what that means is that there is a dominant male that generally is going to have access to all of the reproductively receptive females in his group, or in the orangutan's territory in his territory, essentially. Other distinctive features of orangutans, they have this very flared disc-shaped face. In the males, they have these cheeks, these very flat disc-shaped cheeks that develop at time of sexual maturity. So the dominant males are going to have more prominent cheeks, essentially. And I'll show you a picture here in a moment. All right, let's talk about gorillas. So there are various species of gorillas. There's lowland gorillas, there's eastern lowland gorillas, western lowland gorillas, and mountain gorillas. And unfortunately, they are also very critically endangered. There's only about 700 mountain gorillas left in the wild. Main reason that they're endangered: poaching, the zoo trade and pet trade, also deforestation, and the bushmeat trade as well. So gorillas are found in mainly Central Africa, in Uganda and Rwanda. They are more terrestrial in comparison to the orangutans, so that means they spend more time on the ground. That's mainly due to their size. Male gorillas are at least 400 pounds, female gorillas are around 200. So obviously, locomoting in the trees with a body size that large would be somewhat difficult. It doesn't mean that they can't. They certainly can spend some time in the trees. They just tend to spend more time on the ground. Gorillas are one of the only primate species that are exclusively leaf eaters. So again, they, very large body size equals high caloric demands. So they need to spend a lot of time just chomping on vegetation. So that's the function of that sagittal crest, is the attachment point for those very powerful, strong jaw muscles. They tend to be very docile unless provoked. They tend to mind their own business unless they're, of course, protecting their troop or protecting their young. And again, they have those adaptations for chewing, the sagittal crest, and very large jaw muscles and massive posterior dentition. Humans are found everywhere, but we will learn in chapter 14, 15, and 16 that every single human can trace their ancestry back to Africa. All Homo sapiens originated in Africa approximately 300 to 200,000 years ago. Our locomotion pattern is very unique. We're the only primate species that is predominantly habitually bipedal. So, of course, when we're toddlers, except when we're toddlers, but, our predominant locomotion pattern is bipedal. Some of the apes can be bipedal for short periods of time. We call that partial bipedalism. I'm forgetting the actual term right now. I'll look it up for you guys, but just know that chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas can be bipedal for short periods of time. But if you think about, last time you were at a zoo observing chimpanzees or bonobos or gorillas, you may have seen them stand bipedally, but it was probably for a short period of time. And when they were walking bipedally, it probably didn't look quite as eloquent as it does when a human walks bipedally. So generally, if a chimpanzee or bonobo or gorilla stands bipedally, there's a function to it. They're probably carrying infants, or they're carrying food items, or possibly utilizing a tool. They don't tend to use bipedalism as their predominant mode of locomotion. Humans tend to have an orognathtic or a flatter face. Humans have the highest level of encephalization. Our cranial capacity is the largest in comparison to our overall body size. So just for comparison, a modern Homo sapiens have a cranial capacity between 1,200 to 1,700 cc's, and our closest genetic ancestor or relative is the chimpanzee, and they have a cranial capacity between 300 to 400 cc's. So essentially our cranial capacity is 5 times that of our closest living relative. Chimpanzees. So chimpanzees were once thought to be divided into 2 species, the chimpanzee and then the pygmy chimpanzee or the bonobo. But recent genetic evidence actually really does suggest that these 2 should be completely separate species and not just subspecies. So most modern textbooks are going to classify them as chimpanzees, which is Pan troglodytes, and then bonobos, which are Pan paniscus. So chimpanzees are found in Africa. They are, of all the apes, probably the most aggressive. They tend to have very complex dominance hierarchies. They hunt for meat. They hunt for red colobus monkeys and bush babies, which I'll show you guys some video clips about that next week. They are omnivorous, so that's something that they share in common with us. Chimpanzees and humans are really the only primates that include meat in their diet to any extent. And even at that, it's more of an opportunistic type of feeding. Chimpanzees essentially don't rely upon meat. Chimpanzees spend a lot more of their time consuming various types of vegetation, fruit, insects, nuts, and then they only utilize meat when it's available. Of course, if it's a higher quality food source, so they do certainly utilize meat when they can, but they don't rely upon it for survival. Chimpanzees, another thing that they share in common with humans is they are hunters, and they have very cooperative hunting strategies. I'll show you guys a video clip next week that shows you how primate males are going to organize their hunting parties. So each individual primate is going to have a specific role. And then once the hunt is over, it's generally the dominant male that decides who gets the meat. So that's another integral part of their dominance hierarchies. The dominant male decides who he shares the meat with. Another thing they share in common with humans, they are tool users. Chimpanzees have been observed fishing for termites using specialized twigs that they modify. They can use basic hammer and anvils to break open nuts. They also use leaves as sponges to help sop up extra water. They can also self-medicate. They understand that certain vegetation within their environment, certain fruits have medicinal properties. So I'll show you guys some video clips on that next week as well. And also genetically speaking, chimpanzees share approximately 99% of our DNA. So again, thinking way back to chapter 2, when we learned about genomes and karyotyping, if we were to place a chimpanzee karyotype right next to a human one, a chimpanzee does have 48 chromosomes and a human has 46. But if we were to look at all that genetic material as a whole, chimpanzees and humans are 99% identical. So again, just very strongly suggesting that we share a common ancestry. But it's important to remember we didn't evolve from chimpanzees, however, we share a common ancestor with them. So if you're envisioning your evolutionary tree branches or envisioning a braided delta, the hominoids go off in one direction, the human ancestors, and the pongonids go off in another. Bonobos were once thought to be merely pygmy or smaller versions of chimpanzees, but genetic studies have shown that actually, genetically speaking, they are separate enough to be considered a separate species and not just a subspecies. But interestingly, they are found in very similar environments and have very similar genetic material. However, they behave in quite different ways. So bonobos are sometimes called the hippies of the jungle because they like to make love, not war. They actually use sex to negotiate their dominance hierarchies. They're one of the only species other than humans and dolphins that have been observed to have sex for reasons other than just reproduction. So they're using sex not just to create more bonobos, they're also having sex to negotiate and mitigate tensions. So I have another cool clip for you guys that is going to actually compare chimpanzees and bonobos and look at their mating strategies, look at their dominance hierarchies, their reproductive strategies, and compare and contrast. It's really pretty fascinating because these are obviously two species that are genetically very close. They eat certain, they eat similar things. They live in similar habitats. So it's really interesting that they have such widely different reproductive strategies and dominance hierarchies. Also, bonobo females tend to be dominant over bonobo males. This is due mainly to what Amy Parrish calls female solidarity. So essentially the female bonobos forming these very strong alliances that help them essentially overrule the males in many cases. They also tend to be slightly more gracile, so their bone structure is slightly thinner and more delicate in comparison to chimpanzees, and they tend to be slightly leaner. So here's some pictures here so you guys can see. These are the cheek flaps or the very disc-shaped cheek pouches that you see in the dominant male orangutan. So it's only the dominant male that has these really predominant disc-shaped cheek flaps here. So that dominant male male orangutan has these features at sexual maturity. This is a silverback gorilla, a mountain gorilla. So you can even kind of see where the sagittal crest would be here. This silver coloration is also something that only develops in the dominant male gorilla, that harem master essentially. Gorillas live in one male, multi-female groupings. So that silverback gorilla is then going to be, he has exclusive access essentially to all the reproductively receptive females in his group. So that's the silverback gorilla. And then you see here humans. So the picture here with humans is actually showing you the lack of sexual dimorphism. So on average, males are not that much larger than females. Of course, there is some level of sexual dimorphism, but especially if you think about male gorillas and male orangutans being double the size of female orangutans and gorillas, you can acknowledge that that's not as extreme in humans. Males are not double the size of female humans. So if you're comparing humans to these two great apes, one of the biggest differences is we have a much lower level of sexual dimorphism. That's similar to chimpanzees. Chimpanzees and bonobos, similar to humans, have a lower level of sexual dimorphism. The males are slightly larger than females, but not drastically. So chimpanzees, other differences, if you're comparing them to bonobos, they tend to have more of a tan face instead of this darker brown or blackish colored face in the bonobos. Chimpanzees tend to be a little more robust in their overall skeletal structure, whereas bonobos tend to be more gracile. And then, of course, those behavioral differences that I talked about before. Chimpanzees tend to be more aggressive and negotiate their dominance hierarchies through warfare even, whereas bonobos tend to negotiate their dominance through sexual encounters and tend to be more peaceful. Bonobos tend to have females as their dominance in the group, whereas in chimpanzees, the males tend to be dominant. Okay, I know that was a lot of information all at once. What kind of questions do you guys have?
You said the bonobos, the females oftentimes are the dominant of the pack?
Yes, females are oftentimes dominant in the troop, and that's, at least to the studies I've read, predominantly by Amy Parrish, it's believed to be mainly due to female solidarity. So the females rely upon each other quite a bit for cooperation as far as acquiring food sources and protecting their young. So that's not to say that there's of course also dominant males in the group, but it tends to be actually the females that are the predominant determiners of the dominance hierarchies, because they're also sometimes in control of the sexual encounters as well.
That's actually the second animal I've heard that being the case. Last week I learned that hyenas, the females are like the leaders of the clan. So that reminded me of that. That's all.
Very, very cool. That's very interesting. Yeah, next week is, I mean, I love really everything from this chapter onward, but next week I do have some great video clips for you guys that really show primate behavior, because obviously behavior is a lot more fun if we can watch it. So I have some good clips. One of them is going to compare and contrast bonobos and chimpanzees. There's some great clips on Hominoids baboons showing their very distinctive reproductive strategies. There's some good clips I have on primate culture that are going to show you that it's not necessarily just humans that are capable of culture. So that's all coming up next week. So I do recommend, just because it's kind of hard to show video clips through Zoom. I mean, we might try it a little bit next week, actually, just because I think it'll be fun to talk about. But it may be beneficial for you guys to take a look at those clips sometime before our Zoom meeting on Monday. That way, in case, they're kind of grainy through Zoom, at least you're able to still see those clips and we can talk about them.
Cool.
Good questions. What other questions do you guys have? Okay, so one thing I did want to show you guys, and I'll go ahead and I'll post this as well in your module. The one thing that might be helpful to you guys, and one thing that really helped me when I was learning about primate classification, because I know it is quite a bit of detail, because you're essentially, you're learning which features, which derived features are helping you identify the taxonomic group you're looking at. So to me, one thing that really helped me, and sorry, of course, my dogs are barking in the background, but one thing that really helped me learn it was to draw it out. So, and I'll post these pictures for you guys in the module. Let's pull it up here. All right, so are you guys able to see the picture that I drew?
I don't see a picture you drew, but maybe I'll.
Okay, let me make sure. Maybe I did the share thing wrong. Hold on one second. Let me go here and then go to share screen. And then let's just share everything. So let's go here. Are you guys able to see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, so essentially when we're thinking about order primate, so if you were to envision, it says order primate up here. So you have two divisions that go underneath primate. You have two suborders essentially. So we have the Strepsirrhines, which are also called lower order, and then you've got the Haplerines. And then underneath the Strepsirrhines, and I actually don't require that you understand this deep of classification, but underneath Strepsirrhines, you do have the Lorisiforms, the lorises, and you've got the Lemuriforms, which are the lemurs. And then here, I wrote out to you the features that will help you identify a Strepsirrhine. So things like no post-orbital closure. So remember, the Strepsirrhines have a post-orbital bar, but they do not have full closure. Their orbits or eye sockets are slightly lateral facing. They have that dental feature, the lower incisors that jut straight forward, called the tooth comb. They have the moist rhinarium or the wet nose because they retain that primitive reliance upon smell. They have grooming claws, and then these are features that are actually inside the brain, the enlarged olfactory bulb and enlarged scent gland. Those are related to their primitive retention of the need to smell. And then also I put in here the geographic location. So the Strepsirrhines, the lemurs are found exclusively in Madagascar, whereas lorises are found in Southeast Asia. And then over here with your higher orders, you've got your two distinctions. You have two infraorders that go underneath the Haplerines. So you've got your Platyrrhines, your New World monkeys that are found in South and Central America. They do in fact have post-orbital closure. Their orbits are anterior facing. They have a 2-1-3-3 dental formula. So remember, they have an extra premolar, and they have a prehensile tail. And then over here, you've got your catarrhines, which include old world monkeys, apes, and humans. Geographically, you find them in Africa and Asia. Your dental formula is 2-1-2-3. So that's something that we share with them. Humans, old world monkeys, and apes all have the same dental formula. And they also have a bony ear tube. And then underneath the catarrhines, you have two more distinctions. So these are the two superfamilies that go underneath catarrhines. So under catarrhines, you've got the Cercopithecoids, which are just the old world monkeys. So like all the Haplerines, they have post-orbital closure. They have anterior facing orbits. Like all the catarrhines, they have 2-1-2-3 dental formula. And then the features that make them unique, they have the bilophodont, the two-lobed molars. They've got the Ischial Calicytes, that's the tough sitting pads on the rear. They have a relatively high level of sexual dimorphism, meaning that the Cercopithecoids are going to have high levels of competition for both access to mates and access to resources. They have a bony ear tube. And then your other superfamily is the Hominoids or Hominoidea, which includes apes and humans. They have, just like the other Haplerines, post-orbital closure, anterior facing orbits. And like all the catarrhines, they have a 2-1-2-3 dental formula. What helps distinguish them is they have the Y5 molar pattern. They have a lack of a tail. The apes, the great apes especially, will have a high level SD, mainly gorillas and orangutans. Because remember, the chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans have relatively low levels of SD. The sagittal crest, that bony mohawk running down the sagittal suture that serves as the attachment point for the jaw muscles. The sagittal crest is a feature that you're going to see in male gorillas and orangutans. And then just like the other catarrhines, they also have a bony ear tube. So does something like this, is that helpful to kind of envision the classification scheme?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and post that picture. And of course, you know, what I really recommend is to draw out your own, because the more you draw this out, the more these features will kind of organize in your brain. And of course, you know, all of your exams, all your lab exercises are of course open note. But, you know, once you get to the exam, once you get to Unit 3 exam, it will be timed. So if at least some of this information has been committed to memory, you'll have to waste less time looking things up. Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right, what other questions do you guys have about primate classification? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here. That way, if you guys have questions you want to ask not being recorded, I'll go ahead and stop the recording.